All right, good afternoon. Thank you guys so much for joining us today at the Medal of Honor Museum for our lecture at North Central Texas College through Continuing Ed on the Constitution Day with Dr. David Park. A few housekeeping real quick. Of course, we have refreshments and the restrooms are down the hall, but when you exit today, make sure you don't exit down this way. They've had some construction, so make sure you exit this way. So I'm going to get started and let you know about our amazing speaker today, Dr. David Park. He works here. He's one of our history instructors. He started his college career here at NCTC, so he's a proud Lion alumni. Woo. He has a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree and PhD in history from UNT. He specialized in economic collapses. He says he's fun at parties. He also does local and oral history, which he incorporates into his classes to encourage connections between his students and older generations to foster a sense of community. And that's a key value here at NCTC. We are so proud to have Dr. David Park here as our speaker. Please join me as we welcome him.
Thank you, Desiree. I'm Dr. David Park. Today, I'm going to tell you about the creation of the Constitution. I had COVID last week, and my brain is not functioning 100%. So I will be looking at my notes more than normal. And I'm so excited to be here. When I got the email that someone wanted to talk about the Constitution, I jumped at it. And after I did, I realized what I had gotten myself into. Two things about the Constitution. How can you possibly summarize it in 2 hours? Their entire semesters of law classes, just looking at the Constitution. And also, what new can you say about it? It's kind of been beaten to death at this point. So, I'm going to give you the historical perspective. And we are going to start in 1783, at the end of the French and Indian War. In 1783, the United States had just fought a war against England. The United States was victorious, and it ended with the Treaty of Paris, 1763. This treaty established the United States as an independent nation. It gave the United States all of the land up to the Mississippi River, down to Florida, and England guaranteed it would get its military bases off of U.S. soil. They won the war, but the United States is now the lone republic in a world full of monarchies. We had not seen another example of a republic in more than 1,000 years, been since the Romans. There's no example to go by. There's no roadmap. They are going completely blind into this new reality. And the first government that was established under the United States is called the Articles of Confederation. It essentially maintained the status quo for the United States. It maintained the reason that they made this is because France would not have an alliance with the United States without some unifying document. So they created the Articles of Confederation in 1777 so they could get the alliance with France, which they did and won, but it wasn't even ratified until more than 3.5 years later, 1781, because they were fighting so much among themselves over the land out west. States like Maryland, Delaware, they refused to join unless Virginia would give up, North Carolina and Georgia, give up the land claims out west, and they finally did, and so the Articles were created. But it essentially was not a government, because it was never meant to be a government. It did not create anything resembling a functional government. It created what's called a confederation. A confederation is a loose combination of a bunch of different political entities that are tied together by the very thinnest of fabric. Under the Articles of Confederation, there is no president. There was a president, but he was completely a figurehead. No powers whatsoever. The legislature has no power to tax, to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. There is no judiciary. The government itself has no ability to make any substantial decisions when it comes to how we're going to finance and organize this country. And one of the biggest problems is if they're going to have any sort of change to this, if they're going to make it a better document, they have to have unanimous approval by all 13 states. If anyone has ever served on a committee, you know unanimous approval is not going to happen, and it never would. They could not agree on anything. So now they are a brand new republic, and they are threatened with extinction. So, what happened? The very text of the articles made it very clear they had no interest in giving any power to the government. It was, to quote, a firm league of friendship. That's how vague the language was that connected them. If you want a contemporary example of a confederation, the European Union. No governing power between them or over it. Another example are the Confederate States of America, which was also a bad government. This will not work. It will only last 8 years and then it will be replaced. So, over the next hour and a half, we will answer a few questions. First, why is George Washington the right man, the right place, the right time? Why is he the indispensable man in the creation of the Constitution? Because he is the indispensable man. Second, what are the specific events that happened between 1771 and 1781 and 1787 that will lead this population that had just overthrown a monarchy to create a new central government with more power, significantly more power, and a chief executive? Third, what are the issues and compromises about the Constitution? What were the issues that came up in the debates that reflect the United States to this day? And last, most importantly, why is this so important to us today in 2025 to know this information? Because I guarantee you it is more important today than it has ever been in the 15 years I've been teaching college history. And by the end of this lecture, you will agree with me. Well, not unanimously. Come on. Pat? Am I allowed to kick people out? Yes, only by unanimous vote. Feel free to raise your hand, ask questions. First, we must understand George Washington. We must understand George Washington as a person. He is so interesting, and people get him wrong all the time. He was a traditional classic hero. When I say traditional classic hero, I mean in the Greek and Roman style. He's almost impenetrable. And what's so interesting is that's not just a historical analysis. That was in his own time. In his own time, people had such a hard time being around him or engaging with him because he had this statuesque-like temperament. This was a statue that was carved of him. He would have hated this. The irony of this statue of him. It's like having Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson hated banks and money. So it's one of those ridiculous things they didn't ask a historian about, obviously. He was an impenetrable person, even in his time. He was the most famous American in the world, and he was so incredibly guarded about his reputation. A great story, great anecdote that tells you what kind of person he was. There was a famous painter named Gilbert Stuart. This is one of Gilbert Stuart's paintings. Gilbert Stuart was great at painting people because he would get them to sit down, and then he would get them to relax by just chatting with them, having conversations. This is also a Gilbert Stuart picture. And he was painting George Washington. This is also a Gilbert Stuart picture. And he's sitting there chatting with Washington, chat. Washington sitting there stone cold, being painted, hours and hours. Finally, Gilbert Stuart was just flustered. He said, "Mr. President, or General Washington, you are making this very difficult for me. You're making it very difficult for me to forget that I am Gilbert the painter and that you are General George Washington." Washington looked him dead in the eyes and said, "There is no reason you should forget that you are Gilbert the painter, and I am General George Washington." And then they didn't say another word. Washington was a classical hero, and he acted like it. He behaved like it, and he looked like it. Physically, he was 6'3". He was just a big-built person at the time. I mean, that's very tall, but he's just big-built. And he was one of the most amazing horsemen, and he was also an incredibly graceful dancer. Women that dance with him, he just spins me around just perfectly. He would be a jock today if he was around. Because also he was not an intellectual person. He was very much not an intellectual person, and he knew it. He was very uncomfortable in abstract conversations. Any conversations that were about great ideas, he felt very awkward. When people met him, they were always disappointed. They were like, "I'm meeting George Washington." And then they would meet him, and then he would just stand there and stare at them. And they said it was so awkward. When he was president, once a week he'd hold these levees where he would be standing there, and he would have all these guests come, and they would sit in a half circle in front of him. So he would be standing there on a pedestal. And remember, he's already really tall. He'd stand on a pedestal. They're all in a half circle. And he would stand there like a statue. And then he would come down and walk over. "Hello." And then say a few just banal statements that have no depth, no substance. And then walk back up. And then just stand. Everyone that attended these was like, "That was terrible." He was not the kind of person that you would want to hang out with, to put it mildly. He was what you would call a man of affairs. It means he'd get stuff done. One very big misconception about him is that he was a common man. He absolutely was not. It's impossible to actually know exactly what he was worth, because obviously we didn't have dollars back then, and all of his assets were illiquid in that they were, land and slaves. But he is generally considered to be one of the wealthiest presidents of all time. By a lot of measures, and there's ways you can measure this, he would be considered one of the wealthiest presidents of all time. By some lists, he was the most wealthy until Donald Trump. He is incredibly rich. To give you an idea, his worth of the entire U.S. GDP, he was worth 0.19% of the entire U.S. GDP. Today, that would be about $36 billion, I believe. So he was not an average person, and he knew it, and he didn't act like it. He acted like an elitist because he was an elitist. He acted like British nobility because he thought of himself like British nobility. He behaved like British nobility, and he wanted everyone else to think he was. He was obsessed with looks, and he was obsessed with image and fashion. He spent quite a lot of money making sure that he was always getting the best clothes, the newest clothes. He actually one of the reasons he was so angry at the British was because he felt that the merchant company that he got his clothes from were jacking up the prices. So his grievances with the British, they were less philosophical, less political, less ideological than the other founders. They were very economic and practical. They didn't give him a promotion as general, and also he was pissed at how much money. He thought they were extorting all the wealth from all the Virginia planters. So he had very practical reasons he was against the British. He also had just enormous self-control, and this is something that everyone respected about him. When he was 16 years old, he read a book on the proper etiquette. It was from Italy back in the 1500s, and he handwrote all 110 maxims of what proper behavior was. You don't lean. You don't ever leave your mouth open. You don't ever show any weakness. You don't talk too much. It just wrote down all these at 16, and then he lived the rest of his life by it. So he was so incredibly self-controlled. Everyone commented on his remarkable formality and stiffness when they met him. One of my very favorite George Washington stories. The Constitutional Convention. Alexander Hamilton, his second in command, the people that knew him better than anyone, went up to a guy named Gouverneur Morris and said, "Hey, Morris." Morris is the guy, one of the richest people in the United States, funded the American Revolution. Hamilton said, "Morris, I will buy you a steak dinner and a beer if you go up to George Washington and say, 'Hey, George, how are you?'" Morris said, "You just want me to put my hand on his shoulder and say, 'Hi, George, how are you?'" And Hamilton's like, "Yeah, no big deal, man. Go ahead." Morris did it. Walked up. "Hey, George, how are you?" He wrote in his journal that night, "I would not do that again for a steak dinner for free the rest of my life." The look he gave me, Washington put his hand on his shoulder. Washington looked at him with eyes that said, "I'm going to kill you." No one touched George Washington, and no one called him by his first name. He was not that kind of person. He was remarkable in how little emotion he showed. And we know this because every account of everyone that's around him wrote down anytime he got mad. And there's only a couple times. In all of the writings, I only know of 2 times that there was an outburst, because when he did, everyone was like, "Oh my God," writing down, he got mad. One time as president, there was a newspaper was delivered to the White House that was critical of him. And the cabinet was all there. Someone showed him the newspaper, and he just lost it. "I didn't want to be president. I was forced into this position. I was happy retiring." And Thomas Jefferson, he recorded it. He said, his exact words were, "Washington got angry. The exact line he said was, 'An awkward silence ensued. Difficulty continuing the meeting.'" Because he controlled his emotions all the time. So he earned his reputation for being a classical hero, because the most important thing to know about George Washington is he had moral character. That's what he obsessed over. Moral character. He obsessed over being a person of virtue and living an honest life, a life of duty, responsibility. Those words, those abstract concepts of what makes a person respectable, that we do not think about nearly enough. He obsessed over every one of his actions. He made sure that he was acting in a moral, honorable way. And he did. Especially when temptation was at his door. That is when he was most likely to do what was right for the long term. He would always do what was right over what is easy, because in the long term, he kept that in his mind. He knew in his own lifetime, he was a hero. And he wanted to make sure he maintained that title. He wanted to make sure that he could be that for the United States. That is why he was the right man at the right place at the right time. As general, he was not a great military general, and he knew it. He was not better than the British, and he was aware of it. Against all of his instincts. For the first year, he fought a very aggressive war, but he was not going to defeat the British, and he didn't have to. He just had to run away. And so he swallowed his pride, and he just ran away. That's what he was so amazing at, is running away from the British and keeping them in the field long enough so they could just bankrupt themselves. And it was against his nature, but he did it. But the most important thing he ever did was to give up his generalship. This is when he became the most famous American in the world. The only other American that was comparable was Benjamin Franklin for his scientific experiments. But no one was a classical hero like Washington. When the revolution was coming to an end, all the states kept sending him letters saying, hey, you're going to give up your generalship, because in all of human history, you cannot find examples of people giving up their command of the military when they have it. That is so much power. Santa Anna of Mexico, Kim Jong-un of Korea, Mubarak in Egypt. Anytime a military dictator gets control, they do not give it up. When he gave up his sword, George III, who he had been fighting against, said, and this is a quote, if he gives up his generalship, if he does, he will be the greatest man on earth. And he did. He gave up his generalship. He gave up his sword because, and this is so important to understand, power is something everyone wants, but if you believe in being responsible, if you believe in living with honor and virtue, power is a heavy burden. People seek power, but if you're going to use it wisely, then it is not something you take lightly, and he would not allow himself the luxury of abusing power. And so he, to his core, he did not want it. It was not just show. He did not want it. And when he gave up that sword, 1783, that is when he became the most famous American in all the world. That is when, from that point on, he will spend the rest of his career protecting his honor and protecting people's view of him and protecting his respectability, which is why we would not have a constitution without him. So why was he for the creation of a new constitution? If he was the one that was leading the military in order to fight against the British, why was he wanting a new constitution? Well, first, he was commander of the military. And under the Articles of Confederation, the government could not tax. Yay, we hate taxes. Well, there's never been a functional government that does not tax. The states had to just, government would ask for money from the states, and the states would not give it. He stopped sending letters to the Continental Congress. He just sent them straight to the states saying, we need money, we need supplies, we need stuff. And they wouldn't give it to him. So he got to experience firsthand the weakness of the government. Second, he had a lot of land out west in the Ohio Valley, 30,000 acres. He was planning on giving that to his kids. It's one of the reasons he was so wealthy. It's because he was guaranteed 30,000 acres out in Ohio. Well, you remember that map? Imagine if we were going to spread west, which Americans were going to spread west, and it was a free-for-all. What would happen? States would just fight with each other. The United States would end up like Europe, a bunch of separate entities all battling for the land. It needed to have a strong central government in order to organize that migration westward. in order to organize the land itself. And third, what will happen under the Articles of Confederation? Specific events from 1781 to 1787 that will lead him to support a new government. So what were those events? Under the Articles, the government of the United States could not deal with any of its problems. But it also created its own problems. And this came in the form of foreign policy and domestic policy. In terms of foreign policy, under the Articles of Confederation, the British did not respect the United States. England had promised it would get its forts out of the U.S. territory, and it didn't. The U.S. kept complaining, but England had reasons, that the justifications they gave. But fundamentally, it was because they didn't have to. Under the Articles, there's no money to create a military, so we had no force. We had no strength. Did you remember, what is that famous line by Teddy Roosevelt? Correct. If you have a big stick, you don't have to say things loud. The United States, it was weak. It couldn't tax, couldn't have a military, so it had nothing. It had no power. It had no respect. And England didn't have to give it. England, besides keeping bases in the United States, also their soldiers, they were ready for the U.S. to fail. They were going to come in and swoop up whatever happened as soon as they could, and America knew this. They also had different trade agreements with all the different states, and they'd play the states against each other. It's the same kind of thing the United States did with Native Americans, tribes, and playing them against each other. That's what the British were doing with the colonies, because they can't regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Spain controlled the mouth of the Mississippi River. They got mad at the United States in 1784 because of this disputed territory right here. America said the boundary was down here, 31st parallel. They said it was the Yazoo River, so they just cut off access to the mouth of the Mississippi River. New Orleans. That is, even today, the U.S. economy would just crash when I think the water levels were down a couple of years ago, and we lost something like $3 billion because we couldn't get enough ships through. But back then, that was the main mode of transportation. But there's nothing the U.S. could do about it. The U.S. was weak, and it couldn't demand respect. So other countries did not respect us. But it's the domestic issues that were the real scary ones. Those are the ones that were especially dangerous. And I would argue one of the most dangerous was something called the Newburgh Conspiracy. During the American Revolution, all the officers, all the soldiers were promised money. They were promised pensions. They were promised land. The government could not give it to them. They couldn't tax. They couldn't pay them. The U.S. military was stationed outside of Newburgh, New York, and they were officers, to put it mildly, they were very upset. They hadn't been paid. They had given their lives, they had given their times in order to make this work, and they had got nothing from it. Washington was among them. He had given so much time, so much effort, so much of his own money in order to fight the revolution, and he would not been paid. So they were understandably upset. So they had a plan. They had to plan in order for the military to overtake the Continental Army, for the military to overthrow the civilian government. At first, there was an attempt to bring Washington on board. There were many attempts to make Washington king. They tried. People tried. And I promise you, he absolutely could have, if he wanted to. He got a letter from one of his aides de camp saying, you need to take control of this. Everything's going to chaos. We can't, all the soldiers are angry. You need to make yourself a dictator just temporarily. And he made it very clear that is not going to happen. No occurrence in the course of the war has given me more painful sensations than your information of there being such ideas existing in the army. I must view with abhorrence and reprehend with severity, conception that was big with the greatest mischiefs that can befall my country. In short, he said, no effing way am I going to be king. And he said it as aggressively as you can. The guy who sent it, he spent 3 letters saying like, I'm sorry. He didn't type them, obviously, but But he said 3 letters the day of just apologizing over and over. Washington could not be counted on to overthrow the government because he believed in a Republican government. He believed in civilian control of the government. So there then was a plan to oust Washington as commander-in-chief. The meeting was called for the officers, where they were going to get together and they were going to try to vote him out of being the commander-in-chief. They sent a circular letter out saying, be wary of the man who will recommend moderation. They're saying, don't invite Washington. All the officers got together. They were very mad and they were understandably upset. And in walks Washington. Washington came in. They did not think he was going to show up because they made it very clear they didn't want him there. And this is not just a ragtag group. There were some very high-ranking officers, some of his closest friends that were there, that were part of this. And when you get into their individual stories, it's understandable why they were so upset. Washington asked to speak. Now, most of Washington's great writing was not done by him. It was done by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, because he was not a great writer. He was not a great intellect. But he wrote a Newburgh Address that was very, very incredibly well written, where he begged them how inconsistent with the rules of propriety, how unmilitary, and how subversive of all order and discipline, let the good sense of the army decide. He begged them, please don't do this. And he read his speech. And when he finished, he looked up. He had not changed anyone's mind. No one had faltered in their anger. And he could see it on all their faces. In a last act of desperation, he remembered. A congressman had sent him a letter saying, hey, we're trying to pass a tariff that's going to allow us to get revenue. We're trying to do what we can. And he remembered he had that paper folded up in his pocket. So, last-ditch effort, he pulled out that piece of paper. He opened it up. And then he stared at it. And he didn't say anything. He couldn't read it. His soldiers didn't realize that he needed glasses to read because his eyes had given out. And he didn't believe in showing that kind of weakness to show them that he wore glasses. He said, gentlemen, you will allow me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown not only gray, but also blind in the service of my country. And with that statement, his officers, battle-trained officers, started crying because they knew he had sacrificed as much as any one of them in that room. He had been there with them the whole time, and he did it for a good cause. They voted unanimously to keep him as commander-in-chief of the military. And George Washington single-handedly stopped a military coup in the United States. Jefferson will eventually be one of his biggest detractors, and Jefferson even had to acknowledge the moderation and virtue of a single character probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty, it was intended to establish. Most revolutions, again, we just saw this recently, a couple of years ago in Egypt, lead to chaos, the military takes over, and once the military takes over, it establishes a precedent. The military can take over when things get too chaotic. It's one of the reasons Mexico has never had a stable federal government. There's the military coup after military coup after military coup. This happened because of the weaknesses of the Articles. There was also a problem under the Articles with an economic depression. There was an economic collapse that was very bad in the 1780s. It was a period of, the 1780s was just a period of crisis. It felt like a crisis. And the way states handled it showed how bad the Articles were. I'll give you two examples. Rhode Island, they were the most generous to the farmers and debtors that any state could be. In terms of the size of their population, they printed up more money than any other state in the nation. So what happens when you print up a lot of money? It just worth nothing. Here's how bad it got. They printed up so much of it and they gave it to the debtors so the debtors could pay it off, that there were case studies, there were examples of debtors trying to pay off their creditors and the creditors running away from them on horseback. A high-speed chase on horse, like, let me pay you, go to hell. Because they didn't want that monopoly money. That's how bad it got. And remember, we're not talking about Bank of America and Wells Fargo here. We're talking about just some wealthy people that had money and lent it out. So that is destroying the wealth of people that had the money to lend it out. Because again, we're not talking about massive corporations here. The opposite extreme was Massachusetts. Massachusetts, they enacted very heavy taxes because that's where most of the fighting had happened. They had a lot of debt, and those taxes were bankrupting a lot of their citizens. So a revolt started. Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays, who was a hero of the American Revolution, and he was a hero. It had been some of the biggest battles. He led it, and this was a revolt by angry farmers to try to stop courthouses from enacting foreclosures. And Shays' Rebellion, it ended up being put down fairly quick, but it scared the hell out of everyone. Because most revolutions look like this. Most revolutions in human history are a bunch of poor people that are very angry that they've been poor and oppressed for a long time. American Revolution is unique in that it is led by the richest, wealthiest Americans. And this, though, it scared everyone. Shays' Rebellion was the final straw for a lot of people. Washington was horrified. The accounts which are published of the commotions in the eastern states are equally to be lamented and deprecated. They exhibit a melancholy proof of what our transatlantic foes have predicted, which is even more to be regretted and even more unaccountable, that mankind left to themselves are unfit for their own government. The experiment of greater democracy was not working. This is the most democratic system that you can get. There is no central government, which means all the power is in the states. If all the power in the states was left in the state legislatures, which means all the power is closest to the people. So this is the most democratic system you could get, and it was failing. It was failing very fast, and something had to be done to fix it. That is the reason a lot of these people that we call the Founding Fathers will realize, we all understand, government can be tyrannical. Government can be oppressive. But you know what else can be oppressive? The people. You can have tyranny of the majority or tyranny of the minority. If you want a good case study of this, California has laws that they get to enact anything that democratically, and it is not done well for their taxing system. There has never been a case study of pure democracy that has worked at any scale. In this context, the people that are called the Founding Fathers, they realized that we needed a new system, we needed a new government. We needed one that gives more power to the federal government and one that takes away some power from the people. It's very unpopular to say in the United States, but if you could imagine, just imagine, if we let everyone in the United States tax themselves, would we have a country? Obviously not. No one likes taxes, but you can't have a country without them. So, Founding Fathers realized that something had to be done. Now, there had been attempts to try to solve this problem before. How were they going to get past this? Well, a bunch of states decided to get together at a place called Annapolis. Well, they called a convention. The idea was that we were going to call a convention, we're going to bring everyone together, and we are going to create trade regulations, because England was still messing with trade, and it was a meeting of all the states just to regulate trade. Madison, who attended, said, this will be a case study in seeing how we can unite, and once we get this figured out, then we can build other things to make the government stronger. Only 5 states showed up. Only 5 states sent representatives, so out of the 13, they didn't even have a quorum. So it was an unmitigated failure. It might have amounted to nothing, but fortunately for them, fortunately for us, one person that was in attendance, the Kanye West of the Founding Fathers. He doesn't care what anyone thinks. He does whatever he wants. Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was there, and Hamilton said, well, this didn't work. Next year, everyone meet up. We're going to rewrite the whole Articles of Confederation. This is like, you're starting out as a fighter, and you want to get into boxing, and you go out and you fight just some random no one, and you get your ass just completely handed to you, and then you're like, all right, now I'm ready for the heavyweights. He's calling for revising the entire Articles, and they just failed at just changing one part. However, when they issued the call for a convention, Shays' Rebellion happened. When Shays' Rebellion happened, then everyone started to listen. Question was, will George Washington attend? Because if Washington does not attend, then it will not work. They are trying to create a new constitution that's going to make the federal government stronger, so they need to have someone that they can trust. And so they started desperately courting George Washington. Now, Washington, he was very protective of his reputation, and he wanted a new federal government, one that was stronger, but he was not going to tie himself to something that was going to fail. And so he needed to be fairly certain that it was going to succeed. At first, he was not going to do it, but then James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, a lot of the other Founding Fathers, they just kept him updated about what was happening. And they managed to get him to go by saying, if you don't attend, then it'll look like you are trying to protect your reputation over what's good for the nation. So they would use how much he cared about his reputation, how much he cared about his honor against him. And said, well, it looks like you actually just care about your own ego more than you care about the nation as a whole. So Washington will attend. And without Washington's presence, no one would have trusted this, because the Constitutional Convention, it was held behind closed doors. They would not let anyone in and out. Can you imagine how functional our government might be if there wasn't all this grandstanding? If we didn't have C-SPAN, they might be able to get something done, but they did not want everyone to be like giving speeches back to their constituents and putting on a big show. So everything's done behind closed doors. This level of secrecy could not happen today. No one would have trusted it had Washington not been there. So he was made the chairman unanimously, and it was understood he was going to be chairman. He gave legitimacy to the entire thing. Another person in attendance was Benjamin Franklin. He was the oldest member at 81 years old. He was basically treated like a demigod. He had gout on his feet, so there were 4 slaves or prisoners that would carry him in like he was an Egyptian prince or something every day. Every night they would have to have people babysit him because he loved to drink beer, and he would just talk. So they had to make sure that he wasn't telling everything that was happening. The father of the Constitution, James Madison, he knew more about forms of government in history than any other person alive. He came with more knowledge, and he will create the basis for the Constitution. However, although it's impossible to prove, we probably still would have had a Constitution without him. We could not have had it without George Washington. We would not have the same structure. It wouldn't be as beautiful. But George Washington was the only person that could have brought everyone together and brought legitimacy and trust to the whole thing. Because they had some very big problems they had to solve. In the very macro sense, they had to control democracy. We had too democratic of a system. There was too much power in the hands of individuals. And as unpopular as this is, it is not good to have too much democracy. It has never worked in any real sense. They had to control democracy to protect property. What was happening in Rhode Island? It was destroying people's wealth. What was happening in Massachusetts? It was creating revolutions. In order to do this, they would have to balance power and liberty. This is the tension that is always happening. Power in the federal government versus individual liberty. They go up and down accordingly. And in order to balance power and liberty, the question was going to be whether we're going to have how much we'll have a federal system versus a confederation, or how much power is going to be in the federal government versus the states. These are the broad questions that they are asking. And to answer them, they will just deal with a series of compromises that will unite all the factions. Because that's all the Constitution is. It is a series of compromises. There's compromises between big states and small states over representation. Madison said, unless we have complete representation in both houses of Congress, this is going to fail. And so he wanted a bicameral legislature with absolute representation, but the small states would not allow it. So he came with a plan that wouldn't work. It's called the Virginia Plan. Small states said, no, it should be one state, one vote. So that's where we get the great compromise. Bicameral legislature, the lower house is based on population, the House of Representatives. The upper house, 2 senators per state, regardless of size. That was the great compromise. Madison said he thought that this would break the country. So it was a huge give on his part. In terms of commerce, this ended up being a north-south issue. Northern states, they wanted a tariff. Southern states were agricultural based, they did not want a tariff. Tariffs are only good for manufacturing. What they will come up with was the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Clause. According to the U.S. Constitution, we are only allowed to have tariffs on imports, not exports. That was the compromise that they will work out. And the big one, slavery. Slavery was one that was very interesting because of its evasiveness. There are three big parts of the Constitution that deal with the issue of slavery. First, Article 1, Section 2, 3/5 Clause, representation. Which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons. Article 1, Section 9, slave trade. Article 4, Section 2, the Fugitive Slave Clause. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein, blah, 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 said that you can chase your slaves away, or you can chase your slaves if they run away. What's amazing about it is, in all of the Constitution, the word slavery does not show up once. They used euphemisms every single time. We don't get the word slavery in the Constitution till 1865 when the 13th Amendment abolishes it. Why did they stay so vague on this question? Some people say the Constitution is a slave document. A constitution. It is not. If you want a slave constitution, look at the Southern United States constitutions. Those are slave documents. Those explicitly said this is a slave state. Slave, slave, slave. Constitution, they left it out because even at the time they knew it was a bad word. They knew it would not stand the test of time. It was an ugly institution, and they were aware of that. It was a prudent exercise in ambiguity. So what do we get from the Constitution? We get a lot of checks and balances. We get three branches of government that are separated horizontally. We get a legislature that has the power to tax and regulate interstate and foreign commerce. We get a federal judiciary that was left very vague and very open-ended. Does anyone know, according to the Constitution, how many members are on the Supreme Court? What?
Not enumerated.
One. There's a Chief Justice. That's it. Why did they do this? Because they understood that the number of justices was going to expand based on the size of the country. So they left it blank because they knew it would have to grow as the country grew. That was not an accident. That was not oversight. And then you had a president who had incredible powers. The commander-in-chief of the military, because the number one job of the president is to enforce the laws of the land. Live by the laws and enforce the land. Live by the laws and enforce them. That is why President is Commander-in-Chief of the military. President can veto acts of Congress. President can make treaties with the consent of 2/3 of the Senate. President is given a lot of powers. But there are checks put on the president. Congress can impeach the president, and if impeached in the House, they can convict him and remove him from office. Congress can override a presidential veto. They gave the president a lot of power with the knowledge and assumption that Washington would be the first president. That's why they were willing to give that much power. In terms of separation of power vertically, the Constitution created a stronger federal government. That is the purpose. I've heard someone, current sitting member of the U.S. Senate, said the Constitution was created to limit the power of the federal government. No, it was not. It was created to give more power to the federal government. That is not a difference of interpretation. That is a fact. In order to give more power to the federal government, it specifically put restrictions on states. States cannot coin their own money. States cannot make treaties with foreign nations. And it put restrictions on the people. That's why we have the Electoral College. That's why originally senators were picked by the state legislature not direct elections. They created buffers between the people and the government. What we have, though, is a federal government that is sovereign, is law of the land, but we have states that create their own constitution, have their own taxes, create their own voting laws, and can sue the federal government. They have their own sovereignty. They have the power to sue the government, and they have. And they won. It is a sovereign union of sovereign states, and there was nothing like it in the world at the time. Madison has two things he demanded when he came in there. He said, without these it'll fail. One, complete representation in the legislature. Failed at that. And two, he said the president will have veto over the states. Failed at that too. Madison, the father of the Constitution, he left there thinking, what a piece of crap. This is not going to work. He left there thinking he had failed. This is the government that was created. It then went to the states for ratification. Fun fact about the Constitution. According to the Articles of Confederation, do you remember, what do you need to amend the Articles? Unanimous. According to the Constitution, it would go into effect when 3/4 of the state approved it. The Constitution itself, the Constitutional Convention, was explicitly called to amend the Articles of Confederation. They then arbitrarily changed it from unanimous to 3/4. The Constitution that we are under today is technically unconstitutional. You can't arbitrarily change the rules of the game in the middle of the game. The fight for ratification broke down between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. I'm a historian, so this might resonate with some of you. Do you remember when you were in like second, third, fourth grade? You were in gym class, and the coach was sadistic and put like all the really strong athletic people on one side and all the historians on the other side. And you're just like, oh, please put me in that side. Please put me in that side. You walk in a room and you see on one side Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, George Washington. The other side, George Mason, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams. Which side are you going to? I don't care what the subject is. I don't care what they're talking about. I'm going to the side with Washington. Federalists had the advantage. They even got to name each side. They were the ones that came out swinging, and they called the other side the Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists, they didn't have anything they were for. They were just against the Constitution as it was written. Now, obviously, they fail, but what they did do is they made such a stink about the fact that there is no protection for individuals. They said this is a document of just power. It doesn't give any protection to individuals. So Madison promised, if you support this, we will add in protections, which will become the Bill of Rights. The very first thing Madison does when he was in Congress in 1789, he asked the states to send in amendments, and he got 212 amendments. And he organized them, condensed them, and in the end he got 12 of them. Those 12 he gave, or presented, and 10 of them were passed, and that is the Bill of Rights. Super interesting story. There was 2 other ones. What happened to them? You know, amendments, when we're trying to pass an amendment, there's always a time frame. You have to pass it within this time frame. Not with the first 2. The first 2, they didn't have any time frame on them. Well, one of them said, based on population, every 30,000 people will have another representative. That's still out there, but it'll never happen because the House of Representatives would be too big. The other one, though, said, no law varying the compensation for the service of the Senate and Representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall be intervened. That means, yes, Congress, you can give yourself a raise, but it doesn't go into effect until the next session, so we can kick your ass out if you do that. That was the 12th one. There's a great story about this one too. It was one of the original 12 amendments. In 1982, true story, 1982, there was a 19-year-old sophomore at UT Austin taking a political science class, and he wrote a paper about how that 12th Amendment could hypothetically still be passed because there's no expiration date. And he got a C on the paper. His name is Gregory Watson. We know his name because he went on a 10-year campaign to get his teacher to understand that he did not deserve a C. That is why we have a 27th Amendment, the most recent amendment that is passed to the Constitution, is because of a bitter student. This is why I just throw A's at my students. Go away. I don't want to deal with you. So the Constitution will be ratified. But it was very close. In 1788, New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify it, and so it was technically in effect, but we still didn't have Virginia and New York. Those would be by the slimmest of margins. Virginia, 89 to 79. New York, 30 to 27. And both of them succeeded only because Washington had their backing. Hamilton did the fighting in New York, but knowing Washington supported this, he made it very clear he supported it, knowing he'd be the first president, people were able to get behind it. So, what does all this mean? What does the Constitution reveal about the United States? Let me dispel a myth. The Constitution is perfect, that it is divinely written, and that it is an immaculate document that is sacred and needs to be taken literally. It is not. It is a very flawed document. And I can prove this by a lot of ways. One, if you actually look at the details, every person at the Constitutional Convention afterwards, they said, oh, this is not what I wanted. No one at the Constitutional Convention would say, we've created a masterpiece. This is great. The father of the Constitution, he was so unhappy with it. Another piece of evidence that it is not perfect is that it's been amended 27 times. Also, it's so funny because if you ask people, you meet these people that are like, I carry a Constitution in my pocket. I'm like, okay, cool. Have you read it? Article 1, Section 8. This is the clause that says what the legislature can do. The legislature can raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. We cannot fund any war more than 2 years. I had COVID. Have we fought any war more than 2 years? I don't remember. Have we once in our history, 1863 was Lincoln like, damn. 1943, FDR like, oh, Nazis got us in our Constitution. Did anyone stand up and say, hey, 2 years, come on. No, we just ignore this. Why? Because it's dumb. It's very, very dumb. There's parts that are just, when you get it down to the details, they're a bit ridiculous. However, this does not mean that it is a bad document. It is still, to my mind, the very best Constitution that has ever been written. It is still the most remarkable document, Constitution, that I can think of. Think about this. It managed to create a government that was so functional that it created the structure of a government, but it's adapted over time to change with the world. When people say the Constitution needs to be read literally, well, no, it doesn't, because we don't fight 2-year wars. But it's meant to change over time, and it has changed over time. It is always meant to change over time. That's one of the reasons that they leave the Supreme Court so vague. It's because it was supposed to grow and change with time. The last part, Article 1, Section 8, the very last line of it. Congress can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. What does anything necessary and proper mean? Whatever the hell you want it to mean. They had to leave it that vague. It is one of the shortest constitutions in the world, and that's why it's functional. It gives a functional structure, but it leaves enough vagueness so it can grow and adapt. And this is what's so amazing about it. When this was created, we had 13 states and a population of 3.9 million in 1790, when the first census was taken. That was in an agricultural-based economy. Well over 95% of the people in the country were in farming and just subsistence farming. We had no national transportation system, and Thomas Jefferson never experienced any mode of transportation faster than Jesus Christ. That is the same document that is governing us today when we have 50 states, including Hawaii, Alaska, Florida, Maine, Texas, California. We have a population of 340 million people. We have gone from the industrial age to the digital age. And now we can recreationally take rockets into space. And the governing document still works. How impressive is that? That is absolutely amazing that they could create something that functional. What the Constitution is fundamentally. The Great Compromise was a bicameral legislature, so I call it the ultimate compromise. What is the correct answer to those big questions? Power and liberty, federalism, confederation, big states, small states. What is the answer to that? There is no correct answer because it changes with time. And it has to change with time, and it has to adapt. What the Constitution creates is not answers to any of those questions, because it doesn't have answers, because there are not answers to it. The Constitution gives us a tool to deal with the paradoxes of democracy, because democracy is a paradox of all these different factions and groups trying to figure out how to live together in one United States. That is truly remarkable. The best statement on this, you won't be able to see it, but read Benjamin Franklin's final lines of at the Constitutional Convention. There were a lot of people that were not going to sign it, and Benjamin Franklin gave his last great speech, Having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions even on important subjects, which I once thought right but found to be otherwise. I doubt too whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution. On this occasion, doubt a little. On the whole, sir, I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of the convention who may still have objections to it would with me on this occasion doubt a little of his own infallibility, and to make manifest our unanimity, put his name on this instrument. Just ask people, stop believing you're perfect. Stop believing your views are perfect. And accept that maybe we're all human, fallible. And it worked. What about Washington? What is the big takeaway? two that I will offer you. First, character matters. We should care about these things. I would argue that it's more important now than it has ever been because of the sheer amount of changes taking place in the world. No president can predict what's going to happen. No one could have predicted the last 5 years of everything happening in the world. We have more wars breaking out today, this year, than we've seen since 1946. We cannot predict the future. All we can do is look at people that have character and know that they are going to do right. Know that they're going to try to do right. To try to do the right thing. So what the hell is character? It's easier to understand this with examples than with these vague abstract words. In Washington, he has a lot of examples. One, humility. Washington, in some ways he was arrogant, but in some ways he was very humble. He knew he was not the most intelligent person. He knew he wasn't a great general, so he fought a war that he didn't want to fight the way he did, a defensive war, and went against his aggressive tendencies in battle. He kept people around him that were against him. Thomas Jefferson will be one of his biggest critics when he's president, and he continuously begs Jefferson, stay Secretary of State, stay in the cabinet, because he kept diverse opinions around him so he could hear all sides of an issue so he could pick the best ones. He did not keep yes men around him who were just going to tell him what he wanted to hear. That was not useful. That takes humility to acknowledge you don't know everything. He had humility. Courage. Humans are naturally geared toward tribalism. That is why we survived over other species. We are prone to tribalism. Some people think that being brave and having courage is me and my group standing up to others. I argue the bravest thing you can do is you stand up against your own tribe and you tell them, this is wrong. What he did at Newburgh, he completely agreed with all of his soldiers. They deserved to be paid. They hadn't been paid. They deserved compensation. He stood up against his closest friends and said, what you're doing is wrong. Standing up against your tribe when they're wrong, that is hard. That goes against every instinct in us as humans. That is true courage. Duty and responsibility. He understood that with power comes responsibility. That's why he pushed power away. It wasn't a show. He understood that it is going to be difficult. You're going to make mistakes. And so he will push power away because he genuinely didn't want it, because he wanted to be an honorable person. And that's very, very hard. And virtue. 6 months before he died, Washington, in the summer of 1799, rewrote a will without talking to anyone. In his final will and testament, he freed his slaves. He never spoke out against slavery in his lifetime. He was not vocally against it. He didn't make a big show of it. But he came to the conclusion that slavery was wrong, and he came to that conclusion on his own. As general of the Continental Army, he had black soldiers, several thousand black soldiers. It was after the American Revolution, by his writing, he acknowledged that these are people. He'd been raised in a slave society where slavery, at that point, slavery had been around thousands of years. It was unquestionable. It is a fine institution. You didn't think about it. But he will change his view on slavery because of fighting with soldiers, fighting with African Americans. His realization did not come suddenly, and it did not come easily. But he will free his slaves. And he did it against the will of Martha Washington. He couldn't free, legally she owned a lot of the slaves. So he freed the ones he could and set upon her death. But not only did he free the slaves, he put in his will, teach them to read, teach them to write. The old ones and the young, take care of them financially until they can take care of themselves. Give them jobs, find them work. He put the language in there saying, and you better do this. He said, do not delay. So he didn't leave it vague and open. So you know, the state of Virginia, after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, they will make it illegal to free your slaves, because the implied message is that slaves want to be free, which goes against, by that point, they were saying slavery is a positive good. It's great for blacks. They will also make it illegal to allow slaves to read. So Washington, he will do the right thing. Now, I have heard people criticize him. Well, he wasn't more vocal against slavery in his lifetime. You know who was very vocally against slavery? Thomas Jefferson. Didn't free him. In fact, he became more pro-slavery over time. James Madison, he didn't free him. None of the other founding fathers that had slaves freed their slaves. So what would you rather have? Someone that talks a good talk? Or someone that actually walks the walk? He freed his slaves. He did the right thing in the end because he knew it was wrong. Second thing to take away from Washington. Why don't we have Washingtons anymore? I know I'm not the only one. Every presidential election, it's like 340 million people and this is what we get? We don't have something better? We don't have George Washington? We probably do. They're sure as hell not going to run for president. As we've become more democratic, as we've become more, the people are always right, we have gotten less intellectual presidents. Do you know one of the biggest indicators of who's going to win a presidential election? The answer to the question, who would you rather have a beer with? Think about that. I don't drink. I used to drink, but never once did I sit around with my drinking friends and think, these guys, they should be president. We hate the idea of someone being better than us, someone being smarter than us, someone knowing more than us. How dare anyone think that? We would not elect a Washington today because you wouldn't want to have a beer with him. If he was around, we would not elect him. We denigrate politicians, even ones that are moral. We just find anything we can to attack them with. We denigrate them. Anyone who's going to run for president knows at least roughly 40 to 42% of the U.S. population will hate you, will hate your family, will tear you down every way they can, because after your name there is either an R or a D. And that's the entire reason. We take good men and we run them through the mud because they're not on our team. Why don't we have George Washingtons anymore? We need to look in the mirror to answer that question. Because that's on all of us. And the choices we make about how we treat people that are trying to do good. One last thing I would like to leave you with. If you take anything away from this lecture, I would like you to take away what I believe is the most important legacy of Washington and the Constitution to all of us as Americans. And that is their relationship, represented by their relationship to slavery. Both Washington and the Constitution knew slavery was morally wrong. Both of them. That's why the Constitution doesn't say the word slavery. Both will eventually get rid of them, but neither could do it immediately. Neither could get rid of slavery because doing so would have made the American Revolution impossible. It would have made the Constitution impossible. It would make the new nation impossible. So they lived with something that was morally wrong, that they knew was morally wrong, with the intent in getting rid of it eventually. This is not a moral excuse. As much as it upsets our modern day sensibilities, this is a historical reality. This is a historical fact. They had to accept it, or we don't get a United States at the time. It's this dichotomy between knowing what's morally right and delaying it that makes this subject so controversial and so difficult for people to understand. On the political left, a lot of people denigrate and dismiss anything that's not morally perfect. Anything that doesn't live up to the absolute most moral standards all the time immediately is denigrated and all their work dismissed, all their great deeds dismissed. It is a practice of self-aggrandizement, of the assumption that if I was in their shoes, I would do something differently. On the political right, there's a tendency to ignore and sanitize flaws and imperfections, and to act like they don't exist, and to ignore them, and to cling to a myth of moral perfection, and reject any evidence to the contrary. Both of these positions are wrong. They both miss the point. Washington was a human. He experienced the same laws of gravity, the same laws of physics, the same bodily aches and pains as all of us. The Constitution was written by men. It contains all the flaws, all the paradoxes, all the fears and insecurities that exist in all of us. And that is what makes them so great. When we honestly recognize and acknowledge their imperfections without dismissing their amazing accomplishments, not only does it make what they did so much more impressive, but it means we, with all of our flaws, with all of our past mistakes, can be exceptional too. We can live with character. We can live with courage. We can honestly look at ourselves. We can honestly acknowledge our mistakes. We can honestly look at our failures and commit to being better tomorrow. We can commit ourselves to use this limited time on earth to do good, to be a net positive for humanity in our time, to plant trees under whose shade we will never sit for future generations. This is the legacy of Washington and the Constitution that I believe is worth remembering about our leaders, our nation, and ourselves. Even in the face of our failures, growth is always possible. And this should give us all hope for our potential. And what is more American than hope? Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
I was told that there's some students that might need to take a selfie with me.